of what we do here. And that's that the internet and social media have drastically reduced the cost of creating and disseminating information. So on the one hand, this has allowed a variety of perspectives to flourish. It's encouraged more participation from voices that have been blocked from traditional media environments. And importantly, it's supported the mobilization of new movements. Yet on the other hand, and this is what we're going to focus on today, this new online ecosystem has contributed to several sort of interlinking problems in American or global political discourse, including the spread of misinformation, disagreement about basic facts, and of course, lowered trust in established media. So responding to these challenges, an exciting new line of research has emerged around sort of empirically testing interventions aimed at reducing exposure to and belief in misinformation. And today I'm really thrilled that we have three of the sort of best and my favorite scholars doing work in this area who will present new research and then engage in a conversation. Before I begin, I just want to give a little context to folks who might be encountering the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU for the first time. And so quickly, through cutting edge research, data-driven analysis, and training the next generation of scholars, we work to understand politics, inform policy, and strengthen democracy in the digital age. We'll drop in a second our website and a link to join our mailing list if you're interested. So before we begin, a few notes on the run of show. As Josh mentioned, I'll briefly introduce each speaker before their presentation. Please use the Q&A feature throughout the presentations, but we'll get to questions at the very end. And yeah, with that, I'm excited to get started. So our first speaker today will be Professor David Rand. David is a professor of management science and brain and cognitive sciences at MIT. He uses a cognitive science perspective, grounding the tension between more intuitive versus deliberative models of decision-making to explore topics such as cooperation, outrage, misinformation, political preferences, and social media platform behavior. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Great, thanks so much for organizing this and for inviting me to present. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of some work that we've been doing on, exploring these issues. And in particular, although misinformation, obviously falsehoods have been around forever, but there's this particular flavor of misinformation, these sort of like totally false claims often made in the form of news articles, often spreading online, that's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. And although, there's been a lot of research on it, researchers in general ask questions like, who are the people that are particularly likely to fall for it? And, what are ways to combat it? And, there's a review article that we did that recently that synthesizes a bunch of this. I was actually going to I'm going to put some links in the chat for people that find that useful. But the vast majority of this work has focused on the US with a few occasional studies in the UK or Western Europe. But the misinformation problem is really a very global problem. And from talking to people at social media companies, in general, they're actually much more concerned about misinformation in places outside of the US and the West. But there's been very little research. So what we did in this paper that I'm going to focus on today is we tried to take a global view on misinformation and try and understand, how things generalize beyond the US. And in general, doing cross-cultural studies on misinformation is really hard because the news is different everywhere. But there's a sort of opportunity that's offered by COVID where we can come up with a set of statements related to COVID that are either true or false and that are relevant everywhere in the world. And so what we did is we recruited about 34,000 subjects from 16 countries. They're all social media users, and a quota sampled to match the national distribution on age and gender. Across all of these, or within each country. And we showed everybody a set of 20 statements related to COVID. Half were true and half were false. They were sampled from a larger set of headlines, and the statements were presented without image or source information. And then they were randomized into one of 4 different conditions that will let us look at a bunch of things that I'll talk about. But just to give you a flavor, some of the false headlines were things around like, claiming effective things are ineffective, claiming ineffective things are effective, claiming COVID's not a problem, so on. And then we've got various true headlines. We had one quarter of the people were randomized to an accuracy condition where they were just asked to rate how accurate they thought each headline was. I won't focus on this, but basically what we wanted to see what individual differences consistently predicted being able to tell true from false headlines across countries. And we found like people that were engaged in better thinking, that did more thinking, were less likely to believe the false claims. People that were more motivated to have accurate beliefs did in fact have more accurate beliefs. And we found that various dimensions of ideology were consistently associated with being better at telling truth from falsehood across countries. But a lot of what I've been focusing on in my group's research and what I'm going to talk about today involves sharing. So we had another condition where instead of being asked to say whether they believed it or not, they were asked would they share it or not. And we might think of sharing as a behavioral measure of belief, but if you look at how discerning people are when they judge the accuracy, that is how much more they believe true headlines compared to false headlines, versus how discerning they are in their sharing, so how much more likely they are to share true versus false headlines, you actually see that they look quite different. So if you look at the data from the US, for example, the accuracy ratings for the true headlines were about 0.6 on a 0 to 1 scale, and the false headlines were like half as much, 0.3. So there's a reasonable amount of discernment between the two. But the people that were asked about sharing were much less discerning, less likely to share the true ones than believe them, but also more likely to share the false ones than to believe them. And this isn't just the US. In purple, I'm showing you how discerning the accuracy judgments were across all of these different countries. So for each country, we're saying belief in true minus belief in false, and that's what I show here. In contrast, in orange is how discerning the sharing judgments were. And you have these sort of meta-analytic estimates in purple and orange. And so what you see is everywhere, sharing is less discerning than accuracy, although the extent of that varies to some extent across countries. So there's a disconnect between what people believe and what they share. And we argue that a big chunk of that disconnect comes from inattention, which is not that people purposely share falsehoods and not that people don't care about accuracy, but it's they just sort of forget to think about it. And if they realized it was inaccurate, they say, oh, I don't want to share it. But when you're in the social media context, you're thinking about how many likes you're going to get or whatever, things like that. And you don't even go through that step of saying, well, is it true or not? And so if that's right, then getting people to just consider the concept of accuracy should make them more discerning in their sharing. And so to test this, we had a third condition where, again, people were asked about whether they would share each of the COVID statements. But first, they were prompted to think about accuracy. And the way that we did it is we just asked them to rate the accuracy of one non-COVID related headline at the beginning, such that the concept of accuracy was top of mind for them. And then when they went on to do all the sharing tasks, they would be more likely to stop and think, oh, well, are these things accurate also? We've run a ton of these experiments with subjects in the US. We have a meta-analysis, like an internal meta-analysis that just came out recently, where we find that prompting people to think about accuracy before they make sharing decisions increases how discerning their sharing is. It works for both headlines that are aligned with their politics and headlines that aren't. It works for COVID headlines. It works for conservatives and liberals. It works for a really wide variety of headlines and different ways of prompting people to think about accuracy. And the effect lasts for the duration of the experimental session. And so then we wanted to know, well, is this only the US or does it work more generally? And so here I'm going to show you the increase in discernment, or the change in how discerning people's sharing was based on whether they were in the accuracy prompt condition or just in the control condition. And what you see is meta-analytically, there's about a 20% increase in the quality of what people share when they're prompted, if they're prompted to think about accuracy at the beginning. And that effect is not unique to the US, although it does vary substantially across countries. And it actually makes sense that it varies across countries because, as I showed you before, the extent to which there's a disconnect between accuracy judgments and sharing intentions varies across countries. And so if what the accuracy prompt does is it kind of moves the sharing intentions closer to the accuracy judgments, then that's only going to help in so much as there's a big disconnect in the first place. And so if you plot how effective the prompt was at increasing the quality of what they share against how much of a disconnect there is between accuracy and sharing in the first place, you see they're really strongly related. So essentially, when there's a big disconnect, prompting people to think about accuracy helps. When there's not so much of a disconnect, it doesn't help so much. We've also, in other work, done not just survey experiments, but we have looked at this in the field. We did this Twitter field experiment where we created a bunch of bot accounts that were explicitly bots, but politically neutral. We followed over 130,000 people that had shared links to Breitbart or InfoWars. About 11,000 of them followed us back. Before we started the experiment, we excluded about 6,000 users that seemed like they were bots themselves or hadn't been sharing any news recently. And then we delivered this same treatment where we sent them a random non-political article and just asked them how accurate it was. Basically, nobody responds to the message, but that's fine. We don't need them to respond to the message. We just need them to read it, and then they've been treated. And the idea is when they click out and go back to their feed, they should be more likely to think to themselves, well, how accurate actually is this content? And indeed, we find a significant increase in the quality of the news that they shared afterwards. And as one way of visualizing this, I'm going to do a domain level analysis where there's one plot per news domain. The size of the dot is proportional to the people's pre-treatment behavior. So see pre-treatment, they were sharing a lot of Fox and Breitbart. On the x-axis, you have the quality of the news outlet as judged by fact checkers, which is our sort of outcome measure. And on the y-axis, you have the change in the fraction of tweets these people were making as a function of getting the treatment. And what you can see is there's this strong positive correlation where the effect of the nudge was to increase the quality of the domains that they were sharing as judged by fact checkers. And so the implication is the platforms could do things like while you're scrolling through your feed as a pop-up or as like an in-feed card, say, hey, help us inform our algorithms, rate these random headlines. And even if people threw away the answers, just asking the question would help because it would prime people to think about accuracy while they're in feed. And so I think that's the benefit of this, but I think it actually has a double benefit because I think that there's evidence that you shouldn't, in fact, throw away the responses, but they might actually be useful. We have one paper where we analyzed the extent to which crowd ratings could identify bad claims, and we found that something like 20-ish layperson judgments did as well as had agreed with fact checkers as much as the fact checkers agreed with each other. The SMAP Mob also has a paper on this. They were somewhat less optimistic, but still, if you have you use machine learning on the judgments, you can get as much agreement. Basically, you can have the crowd doing as well as a fact checker. And then also in the cross-cultural study, we asked how well the crowd could do, or if you take the ratings from the accuracy condition, so people are rating the accuracy of the headlines, and we say how well can they tell whether the statements are actually true or false based on these accuracy judgments as a function of the size of the crowd. And what you can see is, although it works a bit better in the US and the UK than other places, and a bit worse in Nigeria or India than other places, almost everywhere with only 20 layperson ratings per statement, you're doing better than 90% essentially. And I think this is much better than most of the machine learning algorithms that platforms otherwise are using. And so I think this is more evidence that this could be good and could work outside of the US. So just to wrap up, I think that we found some striking cross-cultural regularities in terms of both the psychology of misinformation and what makes the interventions effective. Like cognitive, social, and ideological factors all seem relevant for why people fall for misinformation, and sharing tends to be less discerning than accuracy judgments. We also found that these interventions developed in the US tended to generalize. So shifting people's attention to accuracy, or we also had a condition on digital literacy tips that I didn't have time to talk about, both seem to increase the quality of information that people choose to share. and crowdsourcing can help identify low quality information. And these both offer sort of scalable approaches that don't rely on a centralized authority deciding what to censor. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about this stuff, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, David. In terms of the Q&A, you actually have 2 questions already. One sort of more conceptual from Joe, which I think we should probably save, and then one from Thiago that's clarifying. So feel free to type in if you want to, or otherwise we can get to it at the end. All right, our next presentation will be from Professor Nadia Brashier. Professor Brashier is assistant professor in psychological sciences at Purdue University. She studies memory and judgment across a lifespan with a specific focus on cognitive shortcuts people use to evaluate truth. Her research identifies why young and older adults fall for fake news and misinformation. And so I'm going to pass it over to her for the presentation.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So I'm really excited to tell you all about an ongoing project focused on optimizing the delivery of third-party fact checks. So as Dave mentioned, people are a lot more concerned lately about the quality of their news diets than they have been in previous years. And in the face of this intense public scrutiny, social media platforms have recruited third-party fact checkers to flag misleading content. So maybe some of you have seen examples like this in your own feed, where a given story might be marked as disputed by specific sources like Snopes or AP. The rub is that as cognitive scientists, we know that the continued influence effect exists. So corrections don't always stick. Misinformation often continues to influence us even after we receive explicit correction. So as just one example, consider Joe Rogan's influence despite experts reacting to faulty claims about COVID and ivermectin. So at least part of the reason why this happens is concurrent storage. So even if people accept corrective information as true, we're not overwriting those original misconceptions. So neurally, we're storing both the original misconception and the correction in memory. And because the correction is more recent, it could fade more quickly. So that at least partially explains why we see this continued influence effect. And so as cognitive scientists, we're interested in how we can make corrective information more salient and more memorable, and hopefully more effective. So given that fact checks often fade from memory, can we make them more salient by presenting them at the right time? So this question really interested myself and my collaborators, including Dave, who you just heard from, Gord Pennycook and Adam Berinsky. So there are a couple reasons why we might expect timing to matter. So there's one line of work on inoculation showing that exposing people to weak arguments protects them from later persuasion attempts. So for example, explaining that people use false experts or fake experts can protect them from that strategy. So we didn't inoculate people per se, but this is an argument for potentially trying to get ahead of misinformation. So providing fact checks before people even encounter the false information itself. Another line of work shows that in order to correct misconceptions, people need to know what they're correcting. So cognitive revision is easiest, at least sometimes, when those two pieces of information are coactive. So that might be a good argument for the way that platforms currently tend to flag information, where the story and the false tag are both visible at the same time. There's also lots of work from the learning and memory domain showing that corrective feedback can facilitate learning in the long term. And so to the extent that people are evaluating the stories they're seeing in their news feeds, forming their own impression and then finding out that that information was false could be good for their retention of that fact check. So there are different arguments for why we might want to present fact checks before, during, or after initial exposure. And so we pitted these approaches against each other in two large experiments on mTurk. So we took headlines from social media We selected 18 true headlines from mainstream news outlets that didn't contain any factual errors. And then we found just as many false headlines that Snopes, a third-party website that fact-checks news, identified as fabricated. And within each of these categories, the headlines were balanced according to whether they favored conservative viewpoints or favored liberal ones. So we got some pilot data to confirm that. So participants saw these headlines in one of 4 conditions. And so I'm going to collapse across those 2 experiments and everything that I'm showing you because they were so similar. And so in the control condition, participants saw true and false news headlines alone without any additional cues as to whether they were accurate or not. And so they rated the accuracy of these headlines without any fact checks. In the before condition, they received a true or a false tag before they got to the screen where they read the headline and rated its accuracy. In the during condition, both of those pieces of information were visible on the screen at the same time as people were making their judgments. And in the after condition, just the flip of the before condition, participants are seeing the headlines, making their accuracy ratings, and then on a separate screen, finding out whether they were true or false. So 1 week later, we brought most of the participants back to judge those headlines again. So they gave accuracy ratings 1 week later. And this time, no participant saw any true or false tags, so they were presented alone. So these final judgments are what we're interested in. And I'll show you belief in false content first. So I'm showing you how frequently people gave each of these possible responses. So not at all accurate to very accurate. And these are the data for the control condition. And you can see that without any fact checks, a lot of the time people are saying that these false headlines are not at all or not very accurate, which is good. The question is if we can improve upon this by giving people false tags. You can see that giving people a false tag before a false headline didn't improve judgments much. But we do see a benefit of giving people those false tags during exposure to the false headlines. And we see an even bigger boost in the after condition, where participants received a false headline, made up their mind about it, and then got a false tag afterwards. What about the true content? So here are the data from the control condition. As you can see, a lot of the time people were saying that those headlines were somewhat or very accurate without receiving any fact checks. We do see a benefit of people receiving a true headline and a true tag and then a true headline. So a benefit in the before condition, as well as in the during condition. So where both pieces of information were visible concurrently. And again, we see the biggest benefit in the after condition. So while all 3 conditions increase belief relative to the control condition, we see the biggest improvement in that after condition. Another way to look at the data is in terms of discernment. So people's ability to tell true from false content. And when we look at those subtractive scores, it's clear that the after condition is best. So we reduce misclassification of headlines by 25%. Compared to only about 6 and 9% in the before and during conditions. And so we're currently working with Facebook on using these findings to potentially inform their approach to flagging fake news. And one thing that came up is in the real world are people scrolling through their news feeds and their timelines, thinking explicitly about accuracy, right? As Dave mentioned, a lot of the time people aren't spontaneously in this accuracy mindset. So we recently replicated our findings in a 3rd study where everything about the experimental setup was identical, except that initially, instead of making those initial accuracy judgments, people were telling us about their sharing intentions. So whether they would consider sharing a story online, which is more similar to what people are doing on platform. And we were excited to see that our key finding replicates. We saw the biggest boost in discernment 1 week later, when people had previously received fact checks after encountering the headlines initially. And so, of course, third-party fact checking has lots of limitations. For example, scale. There aren't enough professional fact checkers out there to flag every piece of false content. But we think that we can improve this approach by flagging false content at the right time and hopefully making it more memorable over the long term. And so that's all I've got.
Great, thank you so much. Our next and final presentation will be from right now Kevin Aslett, soon to be Professor Kevin Aslett. He is a postdoctoral fellow here at NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. In the fall, he will start as assistant professor at the University of Central Florida in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. His research broadly focuses on the effect of technological change and supernatural institutions on threats to liberal democracy, specifically fake news, populism, and patronage. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool, thanks for the intro, Zeev. Thanks for the other two presentations, really great. So today I'm presenting results from a study co-authored with Andy Guess and 3 co-directors at the center here, Rich Bonneau, Jonathan Nagler, and Joshua Tucker. And we look at the effect of news credibility labels on online behavior, news browsing, as well as perceptions. So we focused on credibility labels because it offers a unobtrusive way of giving individuals contextual information about the news sources that they're viewing. And when we're designing interventions to mitigate misinformation, we want our interventions to be intrusive enough that they're affecting behavior and perceptions, but not so intrusive that we get negative backlash effects. So for example, an example of maybe less intrusive intervention are like general warnings or possible fact checks, because as Nadia said, there's a scale issue with fact checks. And so individuals aren't always able to see fact checks when they see misinformation. And there's kind of the more intrusive example of actually algorithmic down weighting possible misinformation or actual content removal, which we've seen backlash to by lawmakers and users of social media. Then there's this kind of middle ground. And so one example is Dave's accuracy nudges, which I think is a great example of, a subtle intervention that seems to have an effect on sharing of misinformation, or these kind of boosting interventions like increasing digital literacy. And so also in this group, we think are these in-feed source credibility labels, which gives individuals credibility, information about the news sources they're viewing, which then hopefully changes maybe their behavior or their willingness to go to these kind of low quality news sites that produce misinformation. And in addition to these theoretical reasons, there's also this practical reason to test this. There's been a large amount of resources invested in web extensions that create credibility labels. So just recently, there's at least 5 web extensions that created credibility labels that individuals can download these extensions, and it gives them credibility ratings for the news that they're viewing online. But we don't know if they're very effective. We don't know if they're actually changing people's online behavior or changing the downstream effects of misinformation that we know of. So we know source credibility information can correct for misinformation somewhat weakly. And we know that showing source information can improve one's discernment of true and false information. But we don't know what the behavioral outcomes are or what the impacts of downstream consequences of misinformation. And this is what we wanted to set out to test and measure. So to do this, we ran a 2-month study in which we asked over 3,000 respondents to participate in a 2-wave survey panel in which we asked a treatment group to download a web extension that gave individuals source information, and then also individuals were also placed into a control group where they were not asked to download this web extension. Then we monitored their online web browsing behavior, as well as asked them questions about important perceptions that we know are affected by misinformation. And so we chose to use the NewsGuard browser extension to ask individuals in the treatment group to install. So NewsGuard is this web extension that places credibility ratings in the form of a shield logo and contextual information for about 95% of online news content. These ratings are created by independent and professional journalists. And as you can see here on the screen, they create these logos, green, red, and also yellow for satire. And so they give each news domain a rating from 0 to 100. And those those news sources that get above a score of 60 receive this green reliable rating, and those below a score of 60 receive this unreliable rating. And these ratings pop up on individuals' browsers. So those in the treatment group saw these logos when they browsed online during the treatment period in their search engine results. So right next to the URLs or the hyperlinks, they saw these logos, as well as on their social media feeds. So on Twitter and on Facebook, they also saw these logos when they viewed them online. And also when an individual visited a URL, they saw these logos on the browser toolbar. And so it's somewhat subtle, but also very easy to digest information about whether or not you're viewing a reliable or an unreliable news source. So when running this, we recruited a representative sample of individuals from YouGov, so about 3,337 respondents, and we asked a subset to download the web extension and a subset in the control to not download, but they also were asked the same questions in both waves of the survey. We asked individuals questions right as they downloaded the web extension, so right as they were assigned to the treatment and control group, and then about 2 to 4 weeks after. So the treatment period lasted for about 3 to 4 weeks. Individuals had this web extension installed, those in the treatment group. We found that about 80% downloaded the web extension and kept it activated throughout the treatment period, which is pretty high. So I'm going to be presenting to you intent to treat effects here, not a complier average causal effect model, since it's about the same given the high level of compliance. And we validated this by asking individuals to go to a website, which the website then validated whether or not it was active or not. So this isn't self-reported compliance. And to measure the behavioral outcomes, a portion of our sample was from the YouGov Pulse sample. So we had web browsing behavior for these individuals on their desktop computers, about 1,000 individuals, a little under 1,000 individuals, about a third of our set. And then to measure these behavioral outcomes, so whether or not individuals are actually shifting from unreliable news sites to reliable news sites, we summarized panelist news diets using the NewsGuard domain ratings by the counts of unreliable and reliable news sites they visited, pre-treatment versus during the treatment period and after the treatment period, and then the counts of reliable news sites they viewed, the average score, NewsGuard scores of the news sites that individuals visited during these periods, and then the proportion of news they viewed that was unreliable or reliable. And so using these different measures, we can measure whether or not having this web extension installed actually affected their web browsing behavior. What we found is for the average respondent, we didn't really find much of an effect. So for all 5 of these different behavioral outcomes, comparing the treatment period to the pre-treatment period, or even the pre-treatment period to the post-treatment period, we really don't find any statistically significant effects. Now, when we looked at the average reliability score of online news consumed, we do find that individuals in the treatment group did view slightly higher, on average, slightly higher quality news after they installed the web extension, but it was very limited and small and not statistically significant. So one reason this might be the case is we know individuals don't actually view a lot of low quality news, a lot of unreliable news. And actually, when we looked at the proportion of individuals that viewed unreliable news in the pre-treatment period, we actually found that 65% of our sample didn't view any unreliable news. And this is kind of it parallels other research that found this, that people actually don't view a lot of unreliable news online. And so part of the reason we found these low effects is that individuals aren't actually seeing a lot of unreliable news. So we have a low baseline there. So what we decided to do is we subset our sample by the quality of news that individuals saw pre-treatment. So we measured the effects by these subsamples. So we looked at individuals who were like the subsample individuals with the lowest quality news, going down from the full sample to like those below the 90th percentile, those below the 80th percentile. So here on this figure, going from left to right, we go from the full sample, the effect on the full sample, to those below the 90th percentile of news quality viewed, those below the 80th percentile, those below, and all the way down to the bottom 10%. What we see here is the effect appears to grow for individuals who are viewing more low quality information. We actually see a somewhat substantial effect on those individuals, that the bottom 10% of individuals who view the most low quality news. So it appears to have these uneven effects, and it appears to have an effect for those individuals who are viewing the most low quality information. And then when we look at these downstream effects of misinformation, so trust in mainstream media, levels of effective polarization, political cynicism, and belief in popular, false, and true claims in the news, we also don't find an effect on our large sample. Now, this is unsurprising given that we didn't actually find a change in behavior among individuals, among the average respondent. So this kind of mirrors those results. So in summary, we found no robust or consistent effects on news diet quality on average, but we have suggestive evidence that credibility labels do change news consumption among those with the lowest average news diet reliability. And we also didn't identify any downstream effects. I think some important takeaways are that maybe these relatively subtle contextual information may not be sufficiently powerful to shift perceptions of source credibility. Now, related to, I think, Dave's great paper on accuracy nudges and work on accuracy nudges, it's possible that the mechanisms operate differently here. So for individual sharing, there's a reputation cost to sharing low quality information. And so maybe this accuracy nudge pushes them away from sharing things publicly, but it actually doesn't change their consumption patterns privately. So individuals are maybe still likely to consume misinformation at similar levels privately, but they're worried about this public reputation cost. And I think, the big takeaways here is, given these uneven findings that we have, I think future work should sample from the population of interest, like those who consume the most misinformation, and see if these effects are stronger or weaker among these groups, because that's really the groups we care most about of changing their behavior. And I also think these interventions should try to target these groups. So web extensions with these credibility labels should target marketing themselves to these groups the best they can. But that is it. And also, I like to give a big shout out to the Craig Newmark Philanthropies. Without their funding and support, we would not be able to do this research. And so thank you so much. And thanks for listening.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin. And thank you, Kevin, David, and Nadia for your great presentations. Kevin, do you want to unshare our screen for the Q&A portion? Thanks. All right, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask quickly questions to each of our three presenters before we jump to audience Q&A. And just as a reminder for anybody, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask any questions. David, I'll run through them each for each of you in order, and then you can answer them in order. So David, for you, my question was actually going to be sort of around decay, but you already answered that in chat. So instead, I'm going to ask a question related to Kevin's presentation, which is that we know that most people's information diets are relatively high quality. This doesn't mean that misinformation isn't a problem, but most people go out and consume relatively credible information most of the time. And so in your work, you also ask people their sort of perceived veracity of true headlines. And so do you have a sense of what, the extent to which interventions or what interventions work best for actually increasing acceptance or belief of reliable or true information?
Yeah, I think it's,
sorry, go for it, and then I'll jump to Nadia and Kevin.
I think it's a really good question. And, so much of the attention has been focused on people trying to get people to not believe or not share the inaccurate stuff. But I think there's actually way too little attention paid to whether people actually believe things that are true. I think that a problem with a lot of these studies is that the answer is going to depend on which particular items you pick. And so I think in a lot of our studies, we use true items that are true, but are sort of ambiguous. And so I think there's like plenty of true claims you could come up with that you would get all the way up to the ceiling, that like people are like, is Biden the president is actually a tricky one. But, in general, there are a lot of claims like that. So, I think, well, actually, this is relevant to Nadia's study, because in Nadia's experiment, what makes the after warnings particularly good is more that they're really making people believe the true headlines. That the big advantage relative to the other warning or with the other information things is that it improves the increases belief in the true ones. So that's one example of that. And in terms of the accuracy prompt stuff, we find that the accuracy prompts are mostly making people not share things they think are inaccurate, and less making people increase the sharing of things they think are accurate. But also that's not crazy, because when it comes to sharing, I think there's like, and people in general from our studies seem to think there's an obligation not to share things that are false. There's no obligation to share something just because it's true. Like it could be boring or whatever, you know.
All right, great, thanks. So a quick question for you, Nadia. So what really struck me about your paper when it came out was some of the reporting on pre-bunking that came out sort of in the aftermath of the 2020 election, right? And that was, and to me, there was what I thought was sort of disentangling these two types of pre-bunking. The first is what you tested here, right? Getting to someone directly before they see a headline and telling them that it's false. And I was surprised, but that you know, the extent to which it was actually less effective than the sort of post-bunking. The second, which is like a little bit less discreet, is sort of debunking a general line of mis or disinformation before it's disseminated. And that's what a lot of sort of pro-democracy groups focused on in the lead up to the 2020 election. So I was wondering whether any of your research, or whether in general you could just talk about these two different types of pre-bunking, and how we might be able to sort of take your really fascinating results and put them in conversation with some of the reporting that we saw come out of 2020.
Right, yeah, important to clarify that we were not inoculating people or giving people general strategies, right? We have no quibbles with that research showing that that works, right? So, and I mean, you can imagine a lot of advantages to giving people something more like tools in a tool belt rather than having to go after specific headlines, right? So our paradigm doesn't really allow us to comment on anything related to inoculation. We can only say that giving people a false tag right before they see a specific false headline doesn't seem to be especially effective. But nothing about our work says that giving people general strategies is bad or ineffective.
Okay, so this is, I think, a great place where the both and is the answer. Yeah. All right, great. And then quickly for Kevin, my question was going to be around, you know, in general, what, given that there were sort of heterogeneous effects, what that sort of might mean for studies around, you know, the efficacy of interventions. Given that you spoke a little bit to that, either feel free to speak more to that, or actually I want to also jump to a question that was in chat around how we get people with sort of these low quality information diets to take up the type of intervention that you tested. I'm curious, did you ask people their reactions to, you know, or their opinions on actually having downloaded and using NewsGuard? And did you see any heterogeneous effects within that?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, I think, so yeah, we were concerned initially about recruiting individuals who do view a lot of misinformation, and also possibly recruiting individuals who may have a negative view of groups like NewsGuard or liberal institutions that are doing this work. And so one nice thing was that Fox News has actually recommended NewsGuard as a web extension. And so we threw in these recommendation from Fox News and I believe a recommendation from The Atlantic of NewsGuard at the beginning of our study to try to recruit individuals from across the political spectrum to download this extension. And we did find that we did ask individuals how they felt about NewsGuard, and the majority of our respondents actually felt very positively towards their experience, and a small subgroup did view it negatively, or said that they didn't really have any effect, or they didn't notice it at all. But I think the majority said that there was a positive and they used it. I think whether or not it was, I believe it was somewhat heterogeneous in that I think conservatives were slightly more likely to dislike the web extension than liberals. But in terms of age, we didn't find any other heterogeneous effects on that. And yeah, and how to recruit these individuals. I think it's really hard And I think, I've thought about this a lot with Andy, and I have talked about this in the future, and maybe trying to recruit, by buying ads on these websites, to recruit people on these, to get people to take these surveys, or to, get their data, their web browsing behavior, and other different ways of trying to really subsample these groups. Because I think I think a lot of people have recently talked about how, also using the Pulse YouGov sample is problematic because it also has sampling issues. And so trying to get outside of, these sampling groups that we usually sample from, I think is something that I've really thought about, especially for misinformation studies, where we know individuals who are viewing a lot of this low quality information are probably harder to reach and harder to get to than our current strategies are allowing us to. But that's a great question.
As a quick comment on that, we have a paper that we're in progress where we successfully did that we used ads on Twitter targeted at people that had shared links to fake news sites, basically just saying, hey, we want your opinion, take a news survey. And, we managed to get a reasonable number of people to do a survey that way.
Awesome, that's great.
Yeah, and interestingly now, Google there's a sort of new product in beta on Google Search where people see 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of search results where they can see more information about the source, which is, even a slightly lighter touch intervention, but I'd be curious to see data on what effect that has. So I'll sort of start to go in order through some of these audience questions. The first from Joe Goldfarb was for you, Dave, but I think it'll actually be relevant for Dave and Nadia, which is around the extent to which we think these findings should inform sort of company decisions. And so I was wondering, Nadia, you actually mentioned that you were doing some work with Facebook about the implementation or using the results to make choices. So I was wondering whether either of you could speak to this.
So my take, for what it's worth, is that the platforms should be paying attention to this stuff, but they shouldn't say, oh, well, here's a paper that showed this somewhere, so now we're going to put it in this platform. But instead, they should be like, this is something that seems promising. We should run our own on-platform experiments and test how this actually works in our context. Because they run experiments a lot, and it's an easy thing to do, and there's always generalizability questions from experiments, and there's also idiosyncrasies from platform to platform. So to me, this should lead them to test things rather than leading them to implement things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And it's nice when we get to be involved and bring our own work closer to what things might look like on platform. And that's something that we're working on with Facebook.
Yeah, there have been some, there was a recent whole paper by someone at Yale and some folks at Twitter about testing the efficacy of an intervention to mitigate the use of hate speech. And so would love to continue to see more work like that. Josh, you had a question, so I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, Dave, I know we didn't give you that much time to talk and you had a ton of stuff to share with us, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think accounts for some of these cross-national differences. So there was the cross-national difference. So you kind of marched us back one step in the sense that you said, okay, the cross-national differences in sharing has to do with the cross-national differences and sort of the importance of the perception here. But what do you think is driving some of these big findings you're coming across other countries? What are some hypotheses you're working on? Is there anything that seems intuitive that you've rejected at this point that one might jump to that you think that you can tell us now doesn't look like it's right? So super interesting work. And thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So our focus for this was sort of looking for things that generalized across countries. And I think that we obviously found some things that varied across countries, most notably just at baseline, actually one interesting thing that probably went by quickly is we found basically no variation across countries in how much they believed the true headlines or the true statements, and a lot of variation across countries in how much they believed the false statements, which not obvious to me ex ante that would have been true. But we haven't, basically I feel like the cross-national differences are interesting. It's not really, the problem is 16 countries seems like a lot of countries, but if you're trying to look at essentially variation across countries, it's an N of 16. And so you need to have some huge effects in order to find any like country level correlations, coming out there. So for me, I'm largely flagging that as a, important direction for future research.
There are seminal works in comparative politics that have 3 countries. So, though, I think as you show it to comparativists, people are going to start answering. And it would be just, and you're probably right that it's hard to get anything convincing out of that small a number. But on the other hand, there might be some things that we might immediately think. So if you think of like Freedom House scores or any measure of sort of political openness, if that doesn't correlate with 16, it's not the end of the story, but that would be kind of interesting. And if it does, that would also be kind of interesting.
Yeah, totally. So the thing that we did, I'm just taking notes here. We did look at some correlations with like sort of cultural type traits, and I don't remember it, so I'm pulling it up. It's in the supplement. That like, let's see. So some things that correlated were, building the suspense here as I look for it. Come on. Yeah. Well, the suspense is now getting overwhelming. I'm not sure. I have to do that. We looked at like oh yeah, here we go. So like power distance and individualism, these like Hofstadter dimensions, like higher power distance and lower power distance and higher individualism were associated with better discernment. And also like looseness, which is like cultural looseness thing, was like higher cultural looseness was better truth discernment. But GDP per capita and Gini coefficient and stuff like that was not correlated with it. But we should look at more of these sort of politics related measures. I think that's a great suggestion. And I would love to talk offline more if you have specific suggestions of things to do.
So I'm going to go to Kevin next with Tessa's question in chat. Right, so the question was sort of around these people who do have a low quality information diets. Is there a sense that these people would actually be willing to take action, or are they just sort of personally connected to their views, and so their sort of misinformation consumption is like downstream of their viewpoints? I know you've done other work on why people believe misinformation, so I thought this would be a sort of interesting place to bring those two threads together.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And I think this is why this effect we found was so interesting, because we actually I think initially we expected this to push for the web extension or these credibility labels to push people who generally view reliable news, but maybe sometimes view unreliable news, pushes them away completely from unreliable news because they're not really connected. Their views maybe aren't, they don't identify with the views that the unreliable news is usually sharing, but we didn't find that effect. We found that that it was mainly these individuals who were changing their patterns. But they also, I have to also be clear, like they were still viewing a lot of unreliable news. So I think it is really hard to push these people away completely. I think we saw that some, they maybe viewed it a little bit less. But they were still viewing low quality information, even though they knew that they were low quality or unreliable news sources. And so I think it is really hard because, as Tess made this point, that people's views do align likely with these news sources. Now that may occur over time, and I think it is important I think that happens over time, and there is an effect. And so to give people indications of source reliability information before maybe they start to get influenced and start to fall into these rabbit holes of misinformation, I think is important. But yeah, I think it's a difficult question that I think we're still working through.
And just one, if I can chime in on that also, I think that it is a really interesting question, and one actually maybe synergy between what we found in the Twitter field experiment that we ran and what you guys found is that in our experiment, we specifically only targeted people that were sharing bad stuff at baseline. So we were sort of focusing on that group where you also found a positive effect. And in all the survey experiments where we find it working in general, we create exposure. Basically, we balance exposure. Because I think a lot of the reason it may not work for the people that have good diets in the first place is they're just not getting exposed that much to the bad things. So even without basically there's not that much grist for the warnings to work on. And I think in terms of like getting people to uptake this, there's two really fundamentally different kinds of interventions, where there's interventions that you need people to agree to do, like go out and decide to install NewsGuard, versus there are things that are just done to people without them opting into it, which like the platforms or the browsers can do. And so I think a lot of the work that I've been doing is focusing on what can platforms do, precisely because it gets around this problem of needing people to opt into it. If you can just say, look, we're applying this to everyone, then you don't really have the same so much of the problem.
All right, so I think we're at time. So first I want to thank our presenters for really wonderful presentations and fascinating discussion. Everyone here for attending, and then of course Eric Upsall, our Director of Communications, for actually putting together and planning this webinar. There were lots of links shared. Eric will follow up with an email, both with the recording to this webinar, as well as all the links that were shared both in chat and Q&A. And with that, thank you so much for coming, and I hope everyone has a great end to the week.
Thanks for the invite. Good to see you all.